I thought the silence of the Blackwood Science Complex was the hardest part of my job. Then came the rhythmic tapping from a locker that hadn't been opened since its owner died 5 years ago. My name is Leo, and I'm 29. For the past 3 years, my world has been a silent kingdom of empty hallways and sleeping laboratories. I'm the night watchman at the Blackwood Science Complex, a sprawling 5-story monument to human curiosity that after 6 p.m. becomes my own personal mausoleum. I used to think the silence was the hardest part of the job. I was wrong. The sounds are worse. Not the everyday sounds, you understand. I know this building's language. I know the groan of the central heating kicking in on a cold night, the rhythmic hum of the server room on the 3rd floor, the shudder of the ancient elevator in the west wing. These are the building's snores and sighs, the familiar orchestra of a place at rest. I'm a professional. I don't get spooked by a pipe rattling or the wind whistling through a window frame. What I heard that Tuesday night, deep in the forgotten bowels of the geology department, was not part of the orchestra. It started around 2 a.m. during my 3rd patrol. I was in the basement, a place I usually save for last. It's colder down there, and the air has a heavy, mineral scent, like a freshly opened cave, mixed with the faint, sweet smell of formaldehyde from the biology labs 1 floor up. The long concrete corridor was lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast my shadow into a lurching, monstrous giant behind me. I was passing the staff locker room for the geology and anthropology wing when I first heard it. A faint, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. I stopped, holding my breath, my rubber-soled boots squeaking softly on the polished concrete. The sound was metallic, faint, but precise. My first thought was water, a leaky pipe dripping onto a metal duct. I've dealt with a dozen calls like that, but this was different. A drip is random, chaotic. This was methodical. It had a cadence. Tap, tap, tap. A pause, then tap, tap, tap. Again. It was too deliberate, too patient. I stood there for a full minute, head cocked, listening. The sound was coming from inside the locker room. My skin prickled. This was a new verse in the building's nightly song, and it was horribly out of tune. I pushed the heavy steel door to the locker room. It swung open with a low groan, the sound of which momentarily drowned out the tapping. The room was pitch black, save for the weak yellow light spilling in from the hallway behind me. I flicked on my flashlight, its powerful beam cutting a clean white circle through the oppressive darkness. The room was filled with 3 rows of tall, gray, metal lockers, the kind you see in old high schools. They were silent. The tapping had stopped. Of course it had. The silence that followed was somehow louder and more menacing than the sound it replaced. My own breathing sounded like a bellows in the sudden quiet. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and thin. "University security." Nothing. Just the echo of my own words bouncing off the cold metal and concrete. I figured it had to be a prank. Some grad student hiding, trying to get a rise out of the night guard. It was lame, but it happened. I started walking down the first aisle, shining my light on each locker door. All were shut tight, most secured with standard-issue university padlocks. As I reached the end of the aisle and turned into the second, it started again. Thump, thump, thump. It was louder now, sharper. And it was close. So close, I flinched, spinning around, my light darting wildly. The beam landed on a locker in the middle of the row. Locker 113. The sound was coming from inside it. It wasn't a tap anymore. It was a solid, deliberate knock, the kind someone makes with a fist. There was no doubt in my mind. Something or someone was inside that locker. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every rational part of my brain screamed that this was impossible. The locker was barely 2 feet wide, and it was locked from the outside with a heavy, rusted padlock. I approached it slowly, my footsteps unnaturally loud. "Is someone in there?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "This isn't funny. Open the door." A stupid thing to say, I know. How could they open it from the inside? The thumping stopped. I pressed my ear against the cold metal door, listening. For a moment, there was only the frantic thumping of my own pulse in my ear. And then I heard it. A scratching sound. A frantic, dry scraping, like fingernails dragging down the inside of the metal. It was a sound of pure desperation. My blood ran cold. I fumbled for my radio, my fingers slick with sweat. "Dispatch, this is Leo at the science complex. I have a possible situation in the basement." A crackle, then the bored voice of my supervisor, Frank, came through. "A situation, Leo. Did a beaker fall over?" No, Frank. There's someone. I think someone's locked inside a locker in the geology wing. There was a long pause. I could practically hear him rolling his eyes. A locker? Leo, are you sure it's not the pipes again? Remember last month with the trapped ghost in the vents? It's not the pipes, Frank. There's knocking and scratching. I'm standing right here. The scratching stopped. In its place came a new sound, a sound that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It was a wet, gurgling noise, a thick, liquidy sound, like someone trying to clear a throat full of mud. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. It was too guttural, too broken. Leo, you there? What was that noise? Frank's voice was suddenly sharp, alert. I don't know, I whispered, backing away from the locker. My mind was racing. Who did this locker belong to? I shone my flashlight on the small yellowed name tag slotted into the door. The name, typed on an old-fashioned label maker, read, Professor A. Albright. Professor Albright. I knew that name. He was a paleontologist who had retired, no, who had died, almost 5 years ago. He was a legend in the department, famous for his collection of Cambrian-era fossils. This was his locker. It hadn't been opened in half a decade. The wet, gurgling sound was replaced by the thumping again, only now it was faster, more frantic. The whole locker door was vibrating with the force of the impacts from within. Thump, 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 thump. It felt less like a plea for help and more like something trying to break its way out. Leo, what's the status on that locker? Frank's voice crackled over the radio. It belonged to a professor who died years ago, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Frank, something is in here. Get the bolt cutters from the maintenance closet and open it. Cautiously. I'll stay on the line with you. The thought of opening that door sent a wave of pure dread through me. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to lock the door to this room, and never, ever come back. But I couldn't. I was security. What if it was a person? A cruel prank gone wrong? I had to know. I ran, my boots slapping against the concrete, got the heavy iron bolt cutters, and returned to the locker room. The entire walk, the thumping from locker 113 echoed in my mind. When I got back, the room was silent again. Terribly, unnaturally silent. I stood before the locker, the bolt cutters feeling impossibly heavy in my hands. My heart was a drum solo in the quiet. I could smell something now, a faint, foul odor seeping from the vents on the locker door. It smelled of damp earth, of decay and something else. Something acrid and ancient. I positioned the jaws of the cutters around the rusted shackle of the padlock. I squeezed the handles. The metal groaned in protest. I took a deep breath, the foul air filling my lungs, and squeezed harder. With a loud snap, the lock broke and fell to the floor, the clang echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. For a long moment I just stood there, staring at the locker. The handle. All I had to do was pull it. My hand, trembling, reached out. My fingers wrapped around the cold, smooth metal. I pulled. The door screeched open on rusty hinges, revealing the darkness within. The beam of my flashlight cut into the black void of the locker, and the stench hit me like a physical blow. It was the smell of a forgotten tomb, of wet soil and rot, so thick and ancient it felt like I was breathing in liquid history. My eyes watered. At the bottom of the locker, slumped in a heap, were what looked like an old tweed jacket and a pair of trousers, the kind Professor Albright used to wear. They were caked in mud and something dark and glistening that looked like mildew. But they weren't empty. The heap of clothes shifted. A sound, a wet, sickening pop, echoed from within the pile. One of the tweed jacket's sleeves, stiff with grime, twitched and then slowly, unnaturally, began to rise. It wasn't being lifted, it was being pushed from the inside. A long, thin appendage, black and segmented like an insect's leg, but disturbingly long and slender, like a human finger bone stretched to its limit, emerged from the cuff. It was covered in the same slick black mud. It wavered in the air for a moment. Then another joined it, unfolding itself from the lump of clothing. Then a third, and a fourth. They moved with a jerky, disjointed rhythm, like a puppet on tangled strings. Leo, report. What's in there? Frank's voice was a tinny squawk in my ear, a lifeline to a world that still made sense. I couldn't answer. My throat was clamped shut with ice. My mind was refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. The pile of clothes began to rise, to unfurl. It wasn't a person wearing them. The clothes were just a shell, The thing inside was pulling itself up, using those long, spindly limbs to brace against the inside of the locker. A head-like shape, a smooth, rounded mass of dark, fossilized-looking bone, pushed through the collar of the old shirt. It had no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, polished surface like a river stone, except for a single dark hole in the center, from which that terrible, gurgling sound I'd heard earlier now bubbled softly. With a final grotesque heave, the creature pulled itself free of the locker. It wasn't tall. It spilled onto the concrete floor in a heap of clicking limbs and wet fabric, no taller than a large dog. The tweed jacket and trousers clung to its misshapen torso, like a grotesque skin. It was a chaotic assembly of parts that shouldn't fit together. Its limbs were too long for its body, jointed in places a limb has no right to have a joint. It moved like nothing I had ever seen. A stop-motion nightmare brought to life. It was all angles and impossibilities, a creature built from broken rules. "Frank," I finally choked out, my voice a strangled rasp. "Frank, you need to send everyone." "Send everyone? Leo, talk to me. What are you seeing?" How could I describe it? It's made of bones, like old fossils, and mud. It just crawled out of Albright's locker. It's alive, Frank, but it shouldn't be. It looks wrong." The creature on the floor began to move. It dragged itself forward a few feet, its segmented legs scraping on the concrete, with a sound like dragging chains made of rock. It seemed weak, disoriented, like a newborn foal trying to find its feet. It left a glistening trail of black slime in its wake. It moved past my feet, seemingly oblivious to my presence, its eyeless head thing swiveling slowly from side to side, as if tasting the air. My terror was so absolute it had become a kind of paralysis. I was a statue, my flashlight beam pinned to this abomination as it explored the world outside its metal womb for the first time in God knows how long. As it moved into a cleaner patch of light, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Embedded in the center of its chest, where a sternum should be, was a chunk of rock. It wasn't just any rock. It was a piece of shale, and in it I could just make out the fossilized impression of a creature from a prehistoric sea. A trilobite, maybe. But the rock itself, it seemed to hum with a faint internal light, a sickly greenish-purple luminescence that pulsed in time with the gurgling sounds coming from the hole in its head. Was that its heart? Its power source? The thought was insane, but there it was, a crawling, living paradox made of death and ancient stone. It shuffled towards the far wall, its movements becoming slightly more confident, more coordinated. I took a shaky step back, fumbling for the canister of pepper spray on my belt. What good would that do? Could you pepper spray a fossil? The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, a hysterical bubble of madness rising in my chest. The creature reached the concrete wall and paused. It lifted one of its forelimbs, the one that had looked so much like a stretched-out finger bone, and gently tapped the wall. Tap, tap, tap. The same rhythm I'd heard from inside the locker. It was testing the surface, exploring. "Leo, I'm calling the campus police dispatcher. Don't engage it. Just keep your distance and keep your eyes on it," Frank ordered, his voice tight with a tension that mirrored my own. I kept my distance. I backed away another 10 feet, keeping the thing between me and the exit. It seemed so focused on the wall, so curious. Maybe it wasn't hostile. Maybe it was just lost, a freak of nature or science awoken by some cosmic accident. For a split second, I felt a flicker of something other than fear. Pity, maybe. For this creature born into a world that wasn't its own, a walking antique that shouldn't exist. And then it stopped tapping. It went perfectly still. The soft, bubbling gurgle from its head hole ceased. The locker room was plunged into an unnerving silence, broken only by the hum of the overhead lights and my own ragged breathing. It stood like that for a full 5 seconds. Then, its head, the smooth, eyeless stone, swiveled around with impossible speed and locked in my direction. The hole in its center widened, and the gurgling sound returned. But this time it wasn't a gurgle. It was a high-pitched, chittering shriek, a sound that drilled into my skull and vibrated in my teeth. It knew I was there. It had known all along. Before I could even scream, its forelimb, the one that had been gently tapping the wall, blurred into motion. It wasn't the slow, clumsy movement of before. This was impossibly fast, a black whip of bone and rage. It didn't strike at me. It struck the wall right beside my head. There was a sound like a thunderclap as the limb impacted the concrete. The entire wall shook. Chunks of plaster and dust rained down on me as the creature retracted its limb. Where my head had been a second before was a spiderweb of cracks, and a deep, crater-like hole punched straight into the solid blockwork. The limb now held aloft dripped with concrete dust. The chittering stopped, and in the ringing silence that followed, the creature took a slow, deliberate step towards me. Panic finally broke the chains of my paralysis. I didn't think. I just ran. I scrambled backwards, tripping over my own feet, and crab-walked away from the advancing horror. The bolt cutters clattered uselessly from my grip. My radio flew off my belt, and I heard Frank's distant, tinny voice shouting my name before it skittered under a row of lockers. There was no time to get it. The creature was moving with a new purpose, a terrifying predatory grace. Its jerky, awkward shuffle was gone, replaced by a fluid, multi-limbed scuttle that was horrifyingly fast. It flowed over the concrete floor like a spill of black oil, its bone and mud appendages clicking a frantic, terrifying rhythm. I got to my feet and sprinted for the door. I could hear it behind me, the scraping of its limbs gaining speed, the wet gurgle in its head hole rising in pitch to a hungry, rasping hiss. I slammed my shoulder into the heavy steel door, bursting out into the long, fluorescent-lit basement corridor. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, my boots pounding on the floor, the echoes of my flight mixing with the horrifying clatter of my pursuer. I risked a glance over my shoulder as I rounded the first corner. It was in the doorway, momentarily framed by the light of the locker room. It paused there, its eyeless head tilting as if confused by the long, straight line of the hallway. But the hesitation lasted only a second. Then it launched itself forward, its long legs splaying out, and it began to move faster than I thought possible. My lungs were on fire. My only thought was the elevator at the far end of the west wing. It was my only chance. The stairs were too close to the locker room. It would catch me for sure. The elevator was old and slow, but it had a heavy, reinforced steel door. If I could just make it inside and close it, I'd be safe, at least for a moment. The hallway stretched out before me like a sterile, brightly lit tunnel to salvation or doom. I could see the polished steel doors of the elevator shaft glinting in the distance. It felt a million miles away. The clicking sound behind me was getting louder, closer. I could hear the wet slap of its slime trail hitting the floor. I pushed myself harder, my muscles screaming in protest. I've never been a runner, but in that moment, fueled by a brand of terror so pure, it felt like electricity. I was an Olympian. I reached the elevator bay, my hand slapping frantically against the cold, metal up button. A dim, orange light flickered to life above the door. A slow, agonizingly quiet whirring sound started up from deep within the shaft. It was coming, but it was on the fourth floor. I turned, my back pressing against the cold steel of the elevator doors, and faced my pursuer. It stood about 30 feet away, at the other end of the corridor, its strange, angular body illuminated by the harsh overhead lights. It had stopped again, its eyeless face fixed on me. The pulsing, greenish-purple light from the fossil in its chest was brighter now, casting an unholy glow on the polished floor. The sight of it, this impossible thing made of forgotten eons and grave dirt, was so fundamentally wrong that my brain threatened to shut down. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice cracking. It was a stupid human question to ask of a monster. The creature didn't answer with words. It answered by lifting one of its forelimbs and pointing a long, sharp, obsidian-like finger directly at me. The gurgling sound in its head changed. It became lower, more rhythmic. It sounded like imitation, a broken, garbled mimicry of human speech. I heard fragmented sounds, bits and pieces of words buried in the wet static. Pen, door, cold. It was a word salad of horror. And then, with chilling clarity, a single perfectly formed name emerged from the gurgling. Albright. My blood turned to ice. It was speaking his name, or trying to. Was this thing him? A grotesque reincarnation? Had his experiments in paleontology unearthed something they shouldn't have? The questions swirled in my head, a vortex of madness. Behind me, I heard a loud ding, and the hydraulic sigh of the elevator arriving. The doors began to slide open. Salvation. I didn't wait. I threw myself backwards into the cab just as the creature decided its moment of contemplation was over. It launched itself down the hallway, a black blur of clicking limbs. I hammered the closed door button with the palm of my hand. The ancient mechanism groaned, and the heavy steel doors began their slow, deliberate journey to meet in the middle. The creature was covering the distance with terrifying speed. 20 feet. 10 feet. It was going to make it. The gap was only a few feet wide now. A single, black, whip-like limb shot through the shrinking space, aiming for my face. I threw myself against the back wall of the elevator as the bony appendage sliced through the air where my head had been. It struck the control panel with a deafening crackle of sparks and a shower of plastic. The doors slammed shut with a final, booming clang, severing the limb at the joint. The elevator shuddered and, with a lurch, began its slow ascent. I was left in the dark save for the emergency light in the ceiling which cast a dim, red glow over the scene. On the floor, the severed limb, about 3 feet long, twitched and spasmed like a dying insect. It was black and shiny, like wet obsidian, and at the ragged, severed end, a thick, mud-like substance oozed out. I stared at it, panting, my body shaking with adrenaline and residual fear. I was safe. I had escaped. The elevator continued its creaking journey upwards. 2nd floor, 3rd floor. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone. I had to call for help. Proper help. Armed police. The army. Who do you call for a monster made of fossils? As my fingers closed around my phone, the elevator jolted to a violent stop, throwing me against the wall. The red emergency light flickered and died, plunging me into absolute suffocating darkness. Then, a new sound began. A scraping, screeching sound from above me. It was the sound of sharp, hard points dragging across metal. It was coming from the roof of the elevator. It had climbed the outside of the shaft, and now it was trying to get in. The darkness in the elevator was absolute, a thick velvet black that swallowed sound and sanity. The only thing that existed was the horrifying noise from above. Scree, scrape, thump. It was on the roof, directly over my head, its claws or limbs gouging deep furrows into the steel. The elevator car groaned under its weight. My mind, already frayed, supplied the terrifying image. The creature, its broken limb forgotten, clinging to the cables, prying, searching for a way in. My phone was useless, a dead brick in my hand. The severed limb on the floor had stopped twitching, but its foul, earthy stench filled the small space, a constant reminder of the nightmare just inches away. A loud crunch echoed from the ceiling, followed by the sound of twisting metal. It had found the emergency escape hatch. A thin sliver of yellow light from the hallway on the 4th floor pierced the darkness as the creature began to peel the hatch open like the lid of a tin can. The scraping stopped, replaced by the soft, wet gurgle. It was looking down at me, I knew it, its eyeless face peering into the dark. I scrambled to the furthest corner of the cab, pressing myself against the cold walls, making myself as small as possible. The gurgling sound grew louder, closer. Then a single spindly leg, a spear of black bone, descended through the mangled opening of the hatch, probing the darkness. It was over. There was nowhere to run. My life was about to end in a stalled elevator, torn apart by a prehistoric horror. But as the creature's limb swept through the air near my head, my frantic eyes caught a glimpse of something on the control panel, illuminated by the faint hallway light filtering through the broken hatch. The emergency stop button, a big red mushroom cap, was smashed, but next to it the fire service keyhole was still intact. My security keyring held dozens of keys, but one was a universal override for the elevators, the one firefighters use. It was a desperate, insane long shot. As the creature's probing limb swept past me again, I lunged. I slammed the key into the slot, my hands shaking so violently it took 3 tries to get it in. I twisted it. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening hydraulic hiss and a jolt that nearly threw me off my feet, the elevator dropped. Not a gentle descent, but a free fall. The emergency brakes had failed when the creature smashed the panel. I had just released the final lock. The creature above me let out a piercing, chittering shriek of surprise, a sound of stone and rage. I heard a frantic scrabbling as it tried to pull itself back out of the hatch, but it was too late. We were plummeting. The floors flew past in a blur of light seen through the door crack. My stomach was in my throat. The wind roared through the broken hatch. It was a suicide run, but it was better than the alternative. The impact was apocalyptic. The sound was a symphony of destruction, the screech of tortured metal, the explosive boom of the emergency buffers in the pit failing, the shattering of what felt like every bone in my body. The world went white, then black. When I woke up, the first thing I tasted was blood and concrete dust. The emergency lights from the basement corridor were flickering through the mangled, buckled doors of the elevator. The car was a wreck, crumpled like a tin can. My leg was trapped under a bent panel, and a searing pain shot through my entire left side. But I was alive. I pushed myself up, my vision swimming. The severed limb was gone, likely pulverized in the crash. Through the twisted opening in the ceiling, I could see the bottom of the elevator shaft. And lying in the rubble of the pit, amidst shattered concrete and twisted cables, was the creature. It was broken, utterly shattered. The fall had done what I never could. Its spindly limbs were snapped and twisted at unnatural angles. The old tweed jacket was ripped to shreds. The smooth, stone-like head was cracked clean in half. But the thing that drew my eye was the fossil in its chest, the trilobite. The sickly, greenish-purple light was gone. The rock was just a rock now, dull and lifeless. The creature, the walking paradox, was finally, truly dead. Sirens wailed in the distance. Frank must have called everyone. Soon this place would be swarming with cops and paramedics who would never believe the truth. They'd find me, the lone survivor of a catastrophic elevator failure. They'd find the strange collection of muddy clothes and what they'd probably dismiss as unusual rock formations in the pit below. The story would be simplified, sanitized for a world that wasn't ready for the truth. Weeks later, after surgeries on my leg and ribs, I was called into a meeting with the university dean and two men in severe black suits who never gave me their names. They asked me to recount the events of that night, over and over. I told them everything, every impossible detail. They listened patiently, their faces betraying nothing. When I was done, one of the men slid a thick folder across the table. It was Professor Albright's research file. He told me Albright hadn't been a paleontologist, he was an astrobiologist. The fossils he collected weren't from Earth. They were meteorites, specifically fragments recovered from a deep impact crater in the Antarctic. The rock I saw in the creature's chest, they explained, was one of those fragments. Albright theorized it contained a form of dormant, silicon-based life, a life that could lie sleeping for millions of years, waiting for the right conditions. He believed he could reanimate it, that he could bond its silicate structure with organic matter. He'd been using his own DNA, his own clothes, everything stored in that locker, as a template. The knocking I heard, they said, wasn't a call for help. It was the sound of something being born. Albright had succeeded. He had created life from ancient alien stone, and in the process, he had created a monster that remembered him, that wore his clothes, and that had learned one word from his dying mind, his own name. They made me sign a non-disclosure agreement that was thicker than a phone book. They gave me a generous severance package and a pension that meant I would never have to work again. It was hush money, plain and simple. I took it. I moved to a small town 1,000 miles away, a quiet place where the only thing that goes bump in the night is a branch against the windowpane. I never told anyone the full story. Who would believe me? But sometimes on cold, quiet nights, I can still hear it, that faint, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. And I can't help but wonder how many other lockers in how many other forgotten basements are out there, just waiting for a curious night watchman to come along and open the door.